Welcome back. In the last video, we implemented some impact particles using a particle system that came with the Paragon Lieutenant Bellica assets. Now we'd like to add a smoke trail when we fire the weapon. In order to do this, we need a smoke trail particle system. We're going to add this smoke trail particle system to our assets folder in effects. So go ahead and in game assets effects, right click, create a new folder, and call this smoke beam. Now we need a particle system for this, so go ahead and go to my GitHub page, github.com/druidmech, and go to the UE4 CPP shooter series, and you'll find a folder called assets, and in assets a folder called effects, and here you'll find smokebeam.zip. Click on it and then click download. Find the download and then extract it to a folder on your computer. I have a folder in my D drive called assets. I'm going to extract it here. Once you have the smoke beam folder, you're going to want to open up your Unreal Engine project. Right click on the smoke beam folder and click show in Explorer. Here we'll have the smoke beam folder open. So we're in content _ game assets effects smoke beam. Now get your smoke beam folder, open it up, and copy all those contents into the smoke beam folder in our shooter project. And they'll show up here in the editor. So we can close out of these. And now in the editor, we have a couple of materials, a texture, and a couple of particle systems. Now we need to make sure that these are working properly. So double click on m_beam. And you'll see here it says node texture sample missing input texture. So we need to fix this. Close that, and here we'll see we have a texture sample that says error. Now I have a lot of tabs open. I want to close everything except my material mBeam. Now clicking on the default map tab, I'm going to take this beam texture and drag it up to the mBeam material and release it here. And I'm going to replace this old texture sample with the new one. So the pin that was connected to its UVs connected to the new texture sample UVs, and the RGB output pin from the old texture sample will be replaced with the RGB pin from the new one. Hook that up to the A on the multiply, and we can delete the old texture sample. Go ahead and save this material. Now we'll see that our material is behaving properly. Close mBeam and open mBeam Faded. We have the same problem here, so we're going to perform the same fix. Click the beam texture, drag it into mBeam Faded, and replace the old texture sample with the new one. This is the same as mBeam, only it's a bit more faded. Close mBeam Faded, and finally double-click on the particle system called Smoke Trail. Now for this particle emitter, click the Required section, and here for Material, we're going to click the drop down and type in Beam and select mBeam and save. Now close P Smoke Trail and double click P Smoke Trail Faded. Again, click on the Required section and for Material type Beam and choose mBeam Faded for this one. Click Save and close. Now we have two particle systems for smoke trails, and one of them is a little bit more faded than the other one. So you can choose according to your preference. Now we're going to add a variable to our character class for the beam particles. Here in shooterCharacter.h in the private section, let's add a new particle system variable. uParticleSystem, and it's called beam particles. We'll give it the same U property as impact particles. And for the comment, we'll say smoke trail for bullets. Now we'll implement this in fire weapon. Now just before we call line trace single by channel, let's create an F vector for the endpoint for our beam particle system. So let's say F vector beam endpoint. And we're going to initialize this with our endpoint, which is called end. Now, if we don't hit anything with our line trace, then we can just leave our beam endpoint to be the same as the endpoint for our line trace. In other words, we'll just shoot a beam of smoke out as far as we do our line trace. But if we do hit something, we want the endpoint for our smoke beam to stop at the impact point. So just inside the check for if fire hit be blocking hit, we can set our beam endpoint to be the fire hit location. So we'll say beam endpoint equals fire hit dot location. Now we don't really need to draw the debug line or the debug point anymore, as we're now going to have visual effects for both the beam and the impact point. Now we have our beam endpoint. We now need to spawn the smoke trail. So just after our check to see if we got a blocking hit, we're going to make a check to see if our beam particles are valid. So if beam particles, if those are valid and set, then we can spawn our beam particles. So this is how we'll do it. We're going to spawn an emitter, and we're going to store it in a local variable called beam of type uParticleSystemComponent. So uParticleSystemComponent, it's going to be a pointer. We're going to call this beam, and we'll populate it with what's returned by uGameplayStatics spawn emitter at location. Spawn emitter at location takes a uWorld, so we'll pass in get world. Next we need a particle system, for which we're going to use beam particles. And then it takes a transform, and we're going to use socket transform. That gives us the transform information for the barrel socket. Remember, socket transform we got up here from the barrel socket. Okay, so we spawned a particle system using our beam particles, and we stored it in this local variable called beam. So how are we going to make sure that beam behaves the way we want it to behave? In other words, act like a beam of smoke. Well, back in the editor, if we take a look at one of our smoke trail particle systems, like smoke trail faded, we'll see that we have this target section here, and it has a name called target. This is what our particle system uses for the beam behavior. And we can set this because it's a vector parameter. So we're going to do that here after checking if beam particles is valid. And then we'll take our beam particle system component and call set vector parameter. It takes a couple arguments, but we're getting this error because uParticle system component is not defined. So we're going to need to include a header file. So here in the Unreal Engine documentation, I have particle system component, and the include is particle/particle system component. Let's go ahead and include that in our shootercharacter.cpp file, and then come back down, and now we should be able to use Control-Shift-Space to see the parameters we need. So the first is an fname called parameter name. So we can pass in fname with our parameter name, which is target. Next, we need an fvector for the parameter value. We're going to use our beam endpoint. So if we do spawn the beam particles, we're going to set the beam's parameter called target to beam endpoint. And that's going to be the endpoint of our line trace if we didn't hit anything. But if we did get a blocking hit, then we'll set it to the line trace hit location. Okay, let's compile this. Okay, so heading back to the editor, we can close out of our smoke trail. Now we need to set our particle system variable on our character, and we can set it to either pSmokeTrail or pSmokeTrailFaded. Let's open our character folder and shooter character BP. Scrolling down in our combat section, we have beam particles. So we can search for p_smoke, and here we can select pSmokeTrail and compile and save. Now let's test this out. And there's our smoke trail. And I'm going to go ahead and come to the edge of this and see if I can just hit the edge and make sure the smoke trail isn't penetrating the wall. There we go. It looks like it's not going through. It's stopping at the point of impact, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, if you think the smoke trail is too thick, you can change this to P Smoke Trail Faded. Let's give that a try and see how that looks. You can still see it, but it's a little more subtle. How exciting. So this concludes this video. We've added beam particles to our weapon firing. So already this is starting to look more and more like an actual shooter game. In the next video, we're going to start to implement aiming, so things are going to get even more exciting. See you in the next video.